The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 9, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to direct the President to develop a plan for the United States to meet its nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole rose on Wednesday, May 1st, 2019, Amendment number 20, printed in House Report 116-42, offered by the gentlewoman from Nevada, Ms. Lee, had been disposed of. It is now in order to consider Amendment number 21, printed in House Report 116-42. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 21, printed in House Report number 116-42, offered by Mr. Kim of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 329, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Kim, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield myself as time I may consume, and I rise to offer my amendment to H.R. 9. My amendment is straightforward. This bill requires the President to submit a plan to Congress to meet our obligations under the Paris Accords. This amendment ensures that we do not forget the impact of our infrastructure when addressing the threat of climate change. We know that climate change is real. We know that we are already feeling its effects and that it will only intensify. And strong scientific research tells us that storms are getting stronger and more frequent. Sea levels are rising and that this poses a direct threat to our coastal communities. While this bill and the Paris Accords take significant steps to address the root causes of climate change, we must be prepared to address the significant impact it's having on our nation's infrastructure today. My district in New Jersey was amongst the hardest hit by Superstorm Sandy. Toms River alone saw $2.25 billion in property damages, the highest out of any township in New Jersey. And we are still recovering from that storm that hit our state years ago. In 2017, we saw 3 of the 5 costliest storms in our history in Harvey, Maria, and Irma. Rising sea levels are increasing the severity and frequency of flooding and are contributing to beach erosion, posing a major threat to the coastal tourism economies. Climate change isn't just measured by rising tides and rising temperatures, it's measured by the rising costs that will incur on our communities and the investment needed in infrastructure to keep our communities resilient in the face of that threat. In the coming months, as we hopefully take up and pass a bold infrastructure package, this amendment will provide guidance towards achieving the infrastructure resiliency our communities need. We know that infrastructure improvements don't only need to come in the form of pothole fixed and bridges rebuilt. They need to be lessons. They need to lessen the impact of rising storm surges from the next big storm and make sure communities like mine in Ocean County can remain a place for people to raise a family, create jobs, and achieve the American dream. The Paris Agreement's loss and damage provision recognizes the importance of updating our infrastructure to help communities deal with the adverse impacts of climate change. I urge that we include this amendment because it is crucial that there is an understanding from top to bottom the threat that climate change poses and the impact that it will have towards infrastructure resiliency across our country. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and ensure that we're not only protecting our climate, but the infrastructure we need to support our communities. And I reserve the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time to close.
The gentleman is recognized. Oh, sorry, the gentleman reserves.
Yeah.
The gentleman from New Jersey.
Mr. Chair, I will yield 1 minute to the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi.
The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Thank you very much. I thank Mr. Speaker, I thank the gentleman for yielding, commend him for his leadership. This issue of infrastructure resiliency is so important. And as we now discuss doing a major infrastructure legislation to rebuild America in a way that is making it safer and promoting commerce and improving the quality of life by decreasing the amount of time people have to spend in their cars, by increasing broadband and all of the things that enable people in our whether it's healthcare, education, or commerce, The infrastructure is so central to that. And when we talk about infrastructure, we have to talk about resiliency. And when we talk about climate change, we have to talk about infrastructure. So this is a very important amendment, and I rise to support it. And I thank the gentleman for sharing his New Jersey experience in terms of the need for resiliency in this very wise amendment. I also want to rise in support of H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act. I commend Chairwoman Kathy Castor, who is the chair of our select committee on the subject of climate, and also the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Engel, for his leadership on this important issue, which is under the jurisdiction of his committee. They bring vision, they bring values, they bring the voices of members and the American people to make a difference. We thank our members, our freshman members in particular, who have carried out the priorities in the communities to Congress to demand climate action now. And I think it's very appropriate that the gentleman in the chair is on the committee, the Select Committee on Climate, and has been a leader in the private sector, now in the public sector, on this important issue as we go forward. It's time, Mr. Speaker, to end denial about this and start listening to the facts. This is about science, science, science. Is an overwhelming number of 86% of Americans know that this is a crisis. They know that human behavior has an impact on it, and they want us to act. It is from our communities. We all have stories. One of my constituents wrote, "My daughter has developed asthma. It wrenches me to see her used as a canary in the coal mine. We're literally choking on the denial and inaction." Another writes, "Green jobs are guaranteed local jobs and will put people to work. Survival is now poised to become viable in the economic sector." Let me just say this. This is about jobs, 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 jobs. It's very important for our country to be preeminent in the world on the green technologies. And this legislation is in recognition of that. It's about public health, about clean air and clean water, the air our children breathe, the water they drink. And it's about environmental justice in that regard as well, that all children will be able to live in a safe, clean environment in which they can thrive. It's about our national security. Over and over again, the national security experts, the generals, admirals, experts have come to us and said that this is a global security issue because of what the impact climate change and the crisis is doing to the use of water and access to food, and how natural disasters affect migration, and also how that can lead to some initiation of hostilities among people. It is a national security issue in terms of how we use our resources for our national security as well. And it is a moral issue. If you believe, as do I, and some in the evangelical community, that this planet is God's creation and we have a moral responsibility to be good stewards of it, then you would be sure to be a good steward and sign up for climate action now. But even if you don't share that religious belief, we all know that we have a moral responsibility to the next generation to pass this planet on in a better way than we found it, in a very responsible way. So it is, we must take action. The bill demands action now, keeping us in the only international agreement dedicated to ending the climate crisis, and demanding a plan from the administration for a plan for action for the administration. And as Mr. Kim has put forth today, that plan should recognize infrastructure resiliency as the administration comes forward. It sends a signal to the world that the U.S. is in denial about the overwhelming science about climate. But this bill is a step in the right direction. The Select Committee on Climate Crisis and the committees of jurisdiction, we have this Select Committee, and I'm very proud of the work that it is doing. But it is a task for every committee of the Congress to look at the jurisdiction of the committee and to see how, in terms of jobs, public health, national security, and again, our moral responsibility to our children and future generations. It's everybody's responsibility in the Congress. It's a Congress-wide responsibility, but I do thank the Select Committee for the focus that it is placing on all of this, and we will be able to accommodate so many entrepreneurial ideas, new thinking on the subject, being current on the data and on the science. So we have a tremendous generational opportunity and responsibility. I thank all who are involved in this for their extraordinary leadership. Anyone who cares about our planet, our children's future, is deeply in debt to those of you who have taken the lead of it. Under President Bush's leadership, when he was president and we had our Select Committee then, we passed the biggest energy bill in history. While everyone was not in agreement on the climate crisis, we all agreed that we had to take action. President Bush signed the bill in a big ceremony, and it was the equivalent of taking tens of millions of cars off the road and how we raised the emission standards. It was important, and that legislation was the basis for many of the executive actions that President Obama was able to take under the authority of that legislation. And so that was very important, and it was bipartisan. Hopefully we can be bipartisan as we go forward for the next big steps that we have to take. Technology has come a long way since then. Science informs us better. Current events have made it very clear we have an imperative to have climate action now. I, again, urge our colleagues to vote for Mr. Kim's amendment, for H.R. 9, and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll reserve to close.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I'll yield 1 minute to Chairman Engel.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, and let me just say on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee, we support this amendment, both of us. It's a good amendment, and I also want to thank the gentleman for working with the committees on this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to reiterate that my amendment is straightforward here. It's in recognizing the importance of safeguarding our communities and updating infrastructure to protect against the adverse impact of climate change. We can see that storms are getting worse and more costly, and the storms aren't just hitting red states or blue states, they are hitting all of us. And I urge all of my colleagues to stand behind my amendment and lend your support to ensure that our communities are resilient after the next big storm so that they can remain a place for people to raise a family, create jobs, and achieve the American dream. I urge adoption and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, it's again great to be here this morning, and I appreciate the speaker coming down and talking about bipartisan solutions and working together. Obviously, in this piece of legislation, I think the terminology was demanding a plan for the administration. Well, that assumes that the administration would sign this bill, or that also assumes that the Senate would pass this bill. And even if the president would sign a bill that he doesn't want to enact, he would probably then veto the bill he just signed, then we would sustain his veto. So if we really want to move forward, we want to do kind of things that can get through the Senate and get to the president's desk. That's why, all afternoon yesterday we talked about, and this amendment has some of those issues in it: adaptation, resiliency, grid modernization. How do you adapt? So we appreciate the intent on which this amendment is being brought forward. Just also another cautionary note in the Paris Accord, when it talks about address loss and damage associated with the impacts of climate change, it's referring to the Paris Accord's provision to developing countries. It's not that accord doesn't have provisions in developed countries. So as we address this, and maybe as things move forward, my colleague from New Jersey, we can make sure we address that appropriately as far as that. We would like to have these studies done before we go into international agreements that we don't know how they're going to respond, versus after the fact. It's like the cart before the horse. Then we know, well, this is a good deal, we should do this, or maybe we shouldn't. We had a couple amendments last night that talked about all the bad aspects, but none of the positive aspects. We also had a couple that said, let's look at the good and the bad. I would also suggest that in amendment, there may be some areas of the country in which the infrastructure is not going to be harmed. In fact, the area of that country might even benefit from these changes. So with that, I ask my colleagues to vote against the amendment, and I yield back my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 22, printed in House Report 116-42. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk, and I ask for its consideration.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 22, printed in House Report number 116-42, offered by Mrs. Fletcher of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 329, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Fletcher, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
Thank you. I yield myself 4 minutes, and I rise in support of my amendment. Innovation drives the energy industry, and it is important that we continue to follow a technology-neutral approach that allows the best science to flourish and the best technologies to emerge. When it comes to energy innovation, my home in Houston is its home. Houston, long known as the energy capital of the world, is the epicenter of our modern energy renaissance. Home to virtually every segment of the energy industry, including exploration, production, transmission, marketing, supply, and technology, we see opportunities for innovation in all sectors of the energy industry. Over the last decade in particular, energy technology has enabled us to recover resources in new areas and in new ways. Advances in technology that have transformed our energy economy have substantially reduced U.S. carbon emissions. Replacing coal-fired plants with natural gas plants has led to the greatest reduction in carbon emissions in the last 30 years. And we are leading the way on new technologies critical to reaching our emissions reduction goals and combating climate change, like carbon capture technologies. 2 plants are near my district in Houston. We believe in an all-of-the-above approach to energy sources that reduces costs as well as emissions, and we see that in Texas's investment in wind energy. In Texas, we have installed more wind power generation than any other state, 3 times as much as the next leading state. Houston is home to more than 100 solar-related companies. These statistics may surprise some, but they should not, because energy companies, whether renewable or hydrocarbon-based, are really technology companies that apply their technology to energy. My amendment ensures that nothing in this act will favor one fuel source or one technology over another. Climate change is a global threat. We need the input of a diverse and broad coalition of stakeholders who have energy expertise we need to chart our path forward. And we need to encourage innovation and technology in every area. It is for these reasons that I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to reserve my time and close.
The gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds.
I thank the gentlewoman from Texas for yielding to me, and on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee, we support this amendment. It's a good amendment, and I want to thank the gentlewoman for working with the committees on the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Texas.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Texas.
I urge support for my amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this is a perfect example of an amendment that, as we move something forward that might be able to be considered by the Senate and signed by the president, I think we'd be very interested in dealing with. We all know, although I guess I'm a little confused because the amendment says we don't want to be technologically specific, although you mentioned the benefits of carbon capture, sequestration, utilization, which is an amendment we had on in the committee to try to say that here are some good technologies we ought to consider. A lot of folks on our side have been excited about the energy renaissance, the ability to recover more oil. We know the great stories of Texas and the ability to capture carbon and sequester it with utilization for money to help do the other issues. So I think when we move in a direction of a bill that we plan to get through the Senate and the House, we should keep our communications open because I think there are some bipartisan solutions. The Republicans have always talked about conservation, innovation, and adaptation. This is part of the innovation package. We also have advanced nuclear in that package. We also have pump storage batteries in that package. So I think there's opportunities here. We offered, as I said, in the committee, the value of nuclear and advanced nuclear energy, hydropower, carbon capture, and the production of export of natural gas, which is part of my portfolio of voluntary activities is in the Eastern European bloc. And obviously the ability to export natural gas has really been a boon to these countries that don't want to be enslaved to Russian natural gas. So again, there are things we can do. When we talk about innovation necessary to produce a strong economy, energy security, and lower emissions, we have to focus on the benefits of these technologies. So while I can agree with the idea of this amendment, I think it falls short of what is necessary for Congress to assist our priorities. So with that, I encourage a no vote, but I look forward to working with my colleague in the future. And I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
On that, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed.
Mr. Speaker.
Sayana? That was a good call for her to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 23, printed in House Report 116-42. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Massachusetts seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 23, printed in House Report number 116-42, offered by Ms. Presley of Massachusetts.
Pursuant to House Resolution 329, the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise to offer an amendment to H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act. My amendment is a common sense amendment which reaffirms the interconnection between climate change and public health disparities plaguing communities across our country and throughout the globe. Mr. Chair, despite arguments to the contrary by many, there is no such thing as Planet B. This is the only Earth we have, and we need to act like it. And H.R. 9 will ensure that this administration acts accordingly. It has been said that politicians consider future elections, while statesmen and women consider future generations. It is our responsibility to consider future generations, to take the necessary actions to reestablish our nation as a leader in the global fight to combat climate change. The impacts of climate change are not some futuristic threat. The threats are imminent, we're being confronted by them daily, and we must act now. Climate scientists have made clear that if we are to continue down this path without action, it will be too late. So we must act now, We must act today. We must act in this very moment. Climate change and global warming are threatening all aspects of our society and increasing the risk to human lives and health today, particularly for vulnerable communities like Roxbury and Chelsea in my district. These communities are finding themselves on the front lines of the crisis. For example, in Boston's Chinatown neighborhood, a predominantly immigrant and low-income community that falls at the crossroads of two major highways, my constituents breathe some of the most toxic air in all of Boston, air polluted with air exhaust and other irritants that are exacerbated by rising heat levels. And while these are largely invisible pollutants, the impacts are crystal clear. Over the last several years, asthma rates at the Josiah Quincy Elementary School in the heart of Chinatown have jumped from 18 to 25%. Mr. Chair, let me make this plain. Our children are breathing toxic air. These climate injustices are far-reaching. According to a report released earlier this week by the American Lung Association, more than 141 million people in the U.S. live in communities with unhealthy levels of toxic pollution, including many living in my home state of Massachusetts, where air quality has worsened each year. The World Health Organization estimates that 7 million people around the world die each year as a result of these types of air pollution exposure. These toxic pollutants are affecting 9 out of 10 people, the vast majority of the world's population. These statistics are staggering and, quite frankly, terrifying. If it seems we are being fatalist, it's because the threat is a fatal one. Again, my amendment recognizes the critical impact that climate change poses to our fundamental right to breathe clean air, to drink clean water, and to live in clean and safe communities. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I yield 30 seconds of my time to Chairman Engel.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. I thank the gentlewoman for yielding to me, and let me say with pleasure on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee and also the Energy and Commerce Committee, we support this amendment. It's a good amendment, and I want to thank the gentlewoman for working with the committee on this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentlewoman from
Chair.
Massachusetts.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment, and I'd like to reserve and to close the debate.
The gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Massachusetts.
I yield.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, we really don't need a Paris Agreement to make substantial changes in the carbon dioxide or as my colleague was speaking, she was really referring to the Clean Air Act and the 4 criteria pollutants that we've so aggressively addressed since 1992. Having said that, what's better for the poor and the downtrodden is to have a job. What's better for their health and economic opportunity is to have a job. What also helps is that they have a good paying job that provides great healthcare benefits. So from 2015 to 2018, out of the industrialized countries, the United States is the #1 reducer of carbon dioxide. #1. We didn't have to do it with all these international accords. We do it through innovation, technology, and advancement. But carbon dioxide emissions went up last year. That's a known fact. The question is why? Well, we have, Mr. Chairman, we have one of the best economies that I've ever served in the House of Representatives, where there's job wanted signs all over the place. And as the manufacturing sector grows, there's a need to address these emissions. That's why Republicans continue to look forward to the day when we can join with our Democratic colleagues on conservation, innovation, adaptation, moving some bills and processes through the floor that will be received well in the Senate and to the President's desk. So with that, I think rather than focus on the finding, we should debate bipartisan solutions such as boosting research, advanced technologies, and promoting innovation. With that, I'd ask my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I yield back my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Massachusetts. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Marcus was actually right on that one. It is now in order to consider amendment number 24, printed in House Report 116-42. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Washington seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Or printed in House Report number 116-42, offered by Ms. Schreier of Washington.
Pursuant to House Resolution 329, the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Schreier, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. My amendment would support farmers and ranchers who employ agricultural practices that help us meet the goals and ambitions of the Paris Agreement. In order to combat climate change, we are all going to have to work together. Ours is a country that has always banded together to take on the greatest challenges of our times, and this is no exception. This is a time for the United States to not just partner, but to lead the world in protecting this planet for our children and future generations. Now, farmers and ranchers are on the front line of the climate crisis, and they are stepping up. Droughts, fires, and floods are threatening their safety and their livelihoods. My time on the Agriculture Committee and time spent with growers in my district have shown me that farmers are deeply invested in addressing our climate and are eager to be part of the solution. Farmers are already expanding no-till practices, rotating crops, and planting cover crops to sequester carbon, fix nitrogen and other soil nutrients, and reduce erosion. With that healthier soil packed with organic matter, they are decreasing their reliance on fossil fuel-based fertilizers, increasing yields, saving water, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. We must recognize and celebrate the contributions of our farmers who engage in sustainable ag practices. My amendment would support this agricultural ingenuity and creativity and prevent this administration from standing in the way of farmers and ranchers who are fighting climate change. The climate crisis is an urgent matter, and there isn't one silver bullet. Let's recognize that the solution will require something from all of us and support our farmers who can make a tremendous dent in CO2 emissions. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to this amendment, and I will claim my time to close.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Washington.
Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, for 30 seconds.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding to me, and let me say with pleasure on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee and also the Energy and Commerce Committee, we both support this amendment. It's a good amendment, and I want to thank the gentlewoman for working with the committee on this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from Washington.
I would just like to reiterate that it is so important that we all step up. When I hear my colleagues talking about jobs, needing to do other things, waiting, this is too advanced, it is frustrating to see that 2 years passed and we saw absolutely no legislation to protect our climate, and kicking the can down the road further just puts our future in peril along with the future of our children. And so I would ask for that step of faith that we will protect jobs. And I am happy to say that H.R. 9 specifically notes that in addressing our changing climate, this will create jobs, clean energy jobs, and you can rest assured that our economy will flourish with addressing our climate.
Does the gentlewoman yield or reserve?
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois.
I'd like to reserve my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. Gentlewoman from Washington.
I yield back my time.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, to my colleague, and I appreciate it. She has me at a disadvantage because I have a huge ag district, 33 counties in Southern Illinois, more pigs than people. I have corn, beans, and the like. So we appreciate this, and we appreciate this amendment because it's the voluntary action of it and trying to incentivize and appreciate what our agriculture community has done. Because as you know, other proposals out there that are debated in Washington might have some severe effects on agriculture. I also want to take this time to say we did a lot in the last Congress. I think the misnomer is that if we don't say climate change and we move good public policy, that we haven't done anything. Through the House, we passed the Energy Efficient Government Technology Act. That was actually voice voted and sponsored by Anna Eshoo from California. Advanced Nuclear Technology Development Act, Bob Latta from Ohio. Streamlining Energy Efficiency for Schools Act. This is another thing we did in the last Congress. Ozone Standards Implementation Act of 2017. That's Bill Olson from Texas. Satisfying Energy Needs and Saving the Environment. The Sense Act was passed. Blocking Regulatory Interference by Closing Kilns Act by Bill Johnson. Responsible Disposal Reauthorization Act. Another bill to reauthorize the West Valley Act. Of course, I'm a proud sponsor with a huge bipartisan vote of the HR 3053, which was how do you deal with the nuclear waste provision. So we actually moved a lot of bills in the last Congress, and many of those bills were in a bipartisan manner. Yeah, do we not carry the mantle of Paris or climate? But not everything has to be a subtitle of that major provision, especially if you're doing what we're trying to do in the House, which is bring to the floor bills in a bipartisan manner. Conservation, that would be like energy efficiency, new source review, forest management practices. And from Washington State, you understand the forest issues and the concerns. If we do more forest management practices, maybe some of our fires would be less so. Innovation, advanced nuclear power, carbon capture, utilization, sequestration, which we spoke about in the an amendment previously, and also pumped storage batteries. And also from Washington State, you know the benefits of hydropower. And if we can pump that water back up and have a continuous cycle, that's a pretty green use of power. Adaptation, grid modernization, resiliency, and things on GMO crops and stuff, crops that can change if the environment's changing, if the growing cycles change. Right now we have drought-resistant corn. We might have to have corn that grows in wetter conditions. That's all part of the adaptation that we need to talk about. So we appreciate that, your amendment and the chance to discuss these issues. I support voluntary action, the idea of this amendment, but we better serve focusing on examining the cost of these commitments, like some of our Republican amendments try to do as we move this bill outside of the committee. With that, I'd ask to oppose this amendment, and I yield back my time.
Question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Washington. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Washington will be postponed. That's good, Joe. It is now in order to consider amendment number 25, printed in House Report 116-42. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I rise to offer an amendment. It's at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 25, printed in House Report number 116-42, offered by Mr. Neguse of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 329, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm offering an amendment today to provide a pathway for the curriculum in our elementary and secondary schools to include information on the impacts of climate change. 80% of parents and 86% of teachers believe that schools should teach about climate change and its impacts on our environment, our economy, and our society. As our future generations grow up in a world that is impacted by extreme weather events and a changing climate, it is essential that we educate them on the causes and impacts of the crisis, as well as equip them for finding solutions to combat it. Climate change truly is an existential threat, in my view, that we must begin tackling head on. The science is perfectly clear that we have a very short runway to avoid catastrophic consequences for our planet, and this moment requires bold action now. The solutions we find and the bold policies that our country requires to combat this crisis must begin with education. While it is our duty to get the ball rolling on policies and programs that will begin to mitigate climate change-related issues, make no mistake, it is our children who will feel the brunt of the effects that our scientific community has outlined time and time again. When my daughter Natalie, who is now 8 months old, is attending middle school, climate change and its impacts on our planet will be her reality. She should be equipped with every resource we are able to offer her at that time, and that begins with education. This amendment underscores the importance of state and local efforts to teach our youth the causes and effects of climate change. Again, the science is clear, and it is of the utmost importance that the next generation is presented with the facts of this crisis. With that, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I will reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Colorado reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois rise?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment, and I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would yield 30 seconds of my time to the distinguished chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Representative Engel.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I wanted to, first of all, thank the gentleman for yielding and say unequivocally on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee, we, both committees, support this very good amendment. And I also want to thank the gentleman for working with the committees on this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Colorado?
Mr. Speaker, I want to again thank the chairman for his distinguished leadership in chairing the Foreign Relations Subcommittee, full committee, and for his leadership in shepherding this important resolution to the floor. And with that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado?
Mr. Speaker, I would hope that my colleagues across the aisle could come to consensus on this amendment. I think it is a common sense, reasonable amendment that ensures that that our children, that the next generation are, as I said, well informed about the causes and the effects of climate change, so that they can work with all of us to try to stop it and to try to deal with the planetary crisis that we find ourselves in. With that, I would reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Illinois?
I'd reserve my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Illinois also reserves. The gentleman from Colorado?
With that, I will yield back.
The gentleman from Colorado yields. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate my colleague bringing down it. I taught high school for 4 years, so education is a key. This whole provision of moving to the Paris Accord was done without education of members of Congress. It was an executive branch decision. We can debate whether the president had the authority or didn't have the authority, but we think what happened was there was not total buy-in. Had it been presented as an agreement, or had it been presented as a treaty, it wouldn't have passed either chamber. So I do agree that education's very, very important. However, I also believe in local control, and Republicans will always have a challenge with the federal government directing, dictating, and telling our local schools what their curriculum should be. And with that, that's why I oppose this amendment, and I yield back my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor, say aye. Those opposed, say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 26, printed in House Report 116-42. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 26, printed in House Report number 116-42, offered by Mr. Van Drew of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 329, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Speaker. My amendment would add to the finding the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damages associated with the adverse effects of climate change, including extreme weather events. It is well known that extreme weather events, such as hurricanes and tropical storms, are some of the most devastating and costly consequences of a warming world, displacing thousands of people at a time and costing government billions of dollars to recover. The good people of South Jersey know that climate change is occurring because our streets flood almost every time it rains in the coastal areas. Unfortunately, we also have the painful reminder of Superstorm Sandy. On October 29th, 2012, Superstorm Sandy first struck the mainland near Brigantine, New Jersey, in my district, pounding our coast with winds of over 70 miles per hour and 13-foot storm surges, and ultimately killing 147 people. Superstorm Sandy was the most destructive natural disaster ever to strike the state of New Jersey and ranks among the 5 costliest natural disasters in our nation's history. Here's some of the damage caused by Sandy. Almost 350,000 homes were damaged. 1,400 vessels were sunk or abandoned. 70 drinking water systems were affected. 80 wastewater treatment plants suffered power loss or damage. The entire coastline experienced erosion, and untold billions were sucked out of our economy. We need to recognize that climate change is exacerbating the intensity and the frequency of extreme weather events that oftentimes cause the loss of life, property, and security. Staying in the Paris Agreement is good for jobs, and it's good for the economy. Investing in clean, low-carbon technologies will help us expand and develop the industries of the future and help us compete globally against other countries that are already making significant investments in these fields. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, which simply acknowledges the need to reduce and avoid the human and economic toll brought on by the changing climate, and that we need to develop our economy in a sustainable fashion. I now yield 30 seconds of my time to New York Congressman Engel.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding and say on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee, we support this amendment. New York, which is just up from New Jersey, also suffered tremendously from Superstorm Sandy. In fact, a lot of the repairs that we're doing now to the New York City subway is a direct result of that. So I certainly appreciate the gentleman's words and concern. This is a good amendment, and I want to thank the gentleman for working with the committees on this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New Jersey.
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
I'd like to claim time in opposition, Mr. Chairman,
The gentleman is recognized.
and I'd like to reserve my time.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey.
I yield.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, we appreciate this amendment. A lot of these amendments are putting the cart before the house. It would have been interesting to have these debates about resiliency, efficiencies prior to the administration going into the Paris Accords. You do the research first, and then you go make a decision. Now what we're trying to do is say, okay, we have this Paris Accord that the president has stepped away from. Now let's evaluate what impacts are happening then. We did accept an amendment yesterday in this debate to look at both positive and negative aspects, which I think is a fair balance. There's going to be some areas of the country that are going to benefit. There's going to be some areas of the country that are going to be disadvantaged. So I think that is helpful in this debate. There's a lot of talk about an infrastructure bill coming up. We would hope that would be something we would move in a bipartisan manner. I know that it's always going to be, how you pay for it. I'm willing to make the tough calls on how to pay for it. But in that infrastructure bill, it'd be great if the resiliency of communities and these concerns that are being addressed could be wrapped up in something like that. Again, this bill, Leader McConnell just said on the floor, they're not going to address it. Even if they did, the president wouldn't sign it. We will get to a point in time in this Congress when we'll work together. Republicans believe in conservation, innovation, and adaptation. This is part of the adaptation portfolio, and we look forward to working with you as we move forward with that. This amendment does nothing to affect CO2 reduction. So with that, I will oppose the amendment, and I yield back my time.
As surely as a house follows is now. Oh, sorry. The gentleman yields back. The question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I would like a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed.
Mr. Chair, I
It
have
is
an
now in
amendment.
order to consider amendment number 27, printed in House Report 116-42. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 27, printed in House Report number 116-42, offered by Mr. Levin of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 329, the gentleman from California, Mr. Levin, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I rise today to mark a monumental occasion for this body and offer an amendment to H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act. After years of denial, outright lies, and inaction on the climate crisis under Republican leadership in the House, we are finally taking meaningful steps to protect our planet for future generations. While the president denies climate change exists, promotes fake scientists who believe pollution is good, and pulls us backward, we are embracing the scientific consensus that climate change is real, it is driven by human action, and it is already having a detrimental impact on our health and our planet. There are a lot of myths about climate change that we must dispel. One of the biggest myths I hear is that we cannot combat climate change, invest in clean energy, and grow our economy at the same time. We know that isn't true. In California, we've seen strong GDP and per capita income growth while also leading the country in the fight to combat the climate crisis. We also know that renewable energy options are often more affordable for consumers than traditional fossil fuels. That's why my amendment to the Climate Action Now Act adds 3 key facts about our ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and maintain affordable energy options at the same time. First, the greenhouse gas emissions reductions spurred by the Paris Agreement have driven innovation for reliable and affordable forms of energy, which demonstrates that emissions reductions and affordable energy are not mutually exclusive. Second, the United States' long-term greenhouse gas emissions reduction strategy under the Paris Agreement touted energy efficiency improvements in buildings, appliances, and vehicles as a way to cost-effectively reduce emissions and lower energy bills. And third, this strategy has had the support of both industry and consumers. This amendment is very simple. It should not be controversial. Members of both parties should be able to agree that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, invest in clean energy alternatives, and maintain affordable energy options at the same time. I strongly urge my colleagues to recognize this simple fact and support my amendment to H.R. 9. Ultimately, this is about the planet we leave behind for our children and our grandchildren. And with the 5- and 6-year-old at home, I am proud to co-sponsor the Climate Action Now Act and support bold and common sense solutions to the climate crisis. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition and reserve my time.
The gentleman from Illinois reserves. The gentleman from California?
Mr. Chairman, I yield 30 seconds to the distinguished chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Engel.
The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding to me and want to gladly say on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee and also the Energy and Commerce Committee, we support this amendment. It is a very good amendment, an important amendment, and I want to thank the gentleman for working with the committees on this amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chair, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Phillips.
Gentleman from Minnesota is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Mr. Chair, I rise in support of Representative Levin's amendment and H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act. I know when you think of Minnesota, the first thing you think of is snow, and it is true, we know how to handle a snowy winter. But this year, the Midwest was hit with record levels of snowfall, and when all that snow melted, it led to record levels of flooding. Farms and homes across the entire region have been devastated, and it is because of climate change, one of the greatest threats of our time. We must lead and we must be on the right side of history. So I cannot understand why the president pulled us out of the Paris Climate Agreement. I support H.R. 9 to recommit us to this agreement because we should be running towards sustainable solutions, not away from them. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, first of all, I appreciate my colleague, one that I've gotten a chance to know. I look forward to working with him on some issues down the road. I want to also take this time to kind of reject the premise that nothing has been done. And in a debate a little while ago, I mentioned the 15 or 20 bills that had passed the House in a bipartisan manner. Well, these were signed into law. A lot of the hydroelectric extensions, HR 2122, HR 2292 to extend the project of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission involving the Cannonsville Dam. Hydroelectric power is clean, renewable, a lot of, and I can go through a whole list of things that were done. And as I said in the debate earlier, just because we don't put the stamp of Paris or climate change on a piece of legislation doesn't mean that it's going to help reduce our carbon exposure. In fact, our country is has the largest reduction of CO2 than any industrialized nation from 2015 to 2018. Now, having said that, I also would readily admit, and the chairman has heard me say this many times, that in 2019 our emissions went up. But that was because we have a thriving economy, more manufacturing. So this debate is still very important. This amendment suggests that the measures that under the Obama administration was putting in place to meet the commitments on the Paris Agreement were affordable. And a lot of us would reject that premise. When you look at the cost per kilowatt hour of major generation baseload versus the green, and we've always tried to be kind of an all the above. We actually, in part of my congressional district, which is very large, I have one of the biggest wind farms in Illinois. That's just in the Champaign County, Vermilion County, Ford County area in southern Illinois. Also solar power, because of the actions our state General Assembly has done, is we got a lot of solar power construction going on in the state of Illinois. So an all above the approach would be what we would hope for. And we look forward to the time when this too shall pass, this debate on this bill, which will then go to the Senate and die. And then we work back with my friends in Foreign Affairs Committee. Chairman Engel is actually also on the Energy and Commerce Committee. So he knows that we will eventually get to this aspect where we can move in a bipartisan manner. So with that, I would urge my colleagues to vote no on the amendment, and I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 28, printed in House Report 116-42. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 28, printed in House Report number 116-42, offered by Mr. Crow of Colorado.
Pursuant to House Resolution 329, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. I rise today to highlight the continuing work at the Department of Defense to procure renewable energy, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and make our military more resilient in the face of climate change. The American military is the strongest in the world and is also the world's biggest consumer of energy. In 2017, our armed forces consumed over 85 million barrels of fuel to power ships, aircraft, combat vehicles, and bases. As a combat veteran, I know firsthand that our reliance on fossil fuels at home and on the battlefield makes us very vulnerable. Moreover, current and former DoD civilian and military leaders have argued that climate change presents a rising threat to our force readiness and has exposed vulnerabilities of critical operations. They have argued that climate change is an urgent national security threat, and I agree. Warming oceans lead to higher tides, putting our nation's critical infrastructure at risk, Severe weather has already wrought havoc on military assets, including Tyndall Air Force Base, which will likely require $5 billion in repairs after Hurricane Michael. Climate change is already causing mass migrations that affect the stability of nations and will put our national security and that of our allies at risk. The purpose of my amendment is to make the DoD's contributions to the government's sustainability efforts a part of the conversation surrounding H.R. 9, and the DoD's accomplishments should be lauded. The DoD has invested heavily in microgrids, renewable energy resources, and fuel-efficient vehicles. Additionally, last year's NDAA required the military to build on its obligations to address climate change by incorporating energy and climate resiliency efforts into its installation and operational planning. The DoD has done a lot so far and is a model for the rest of the U.S. government, but there is more to be done. Going forward, we have a unique opportunity to support sustainable policies while also securing our bases, saving taxpayer money, and protecting the environment. One of the best examples is Fort Hood, Texas. Fort Hood has invested in technology to harness renewable energy and ensure that power is being efficiently managed. It is estimated that the combination of microgrids and renewable energy will save Fort Hood $100 million in energy costs. It is also hardened against potential vulnerabilities in the electrical grid, which is a win for our security. We must scale smart, practical solutions like these at the DoD to make our force more resilient, agile, and efficient. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield 30 seconds to the chairman, Mr. Engel from New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding, and I'm happy to say that on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee, we support this amendment. It is a very good amendment, and I also want to thank the gentleman for working with our committees on this amendment. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman
Mr.
from
Chair, I
Colorado
reserve the
is
balance of my
recognized.
time. I reserve the balance of my
Reserve.
time.
The gentleman, sorry, for what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition and reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Mr. Chair, simply put, the federal government cannot meet its obligations under the Paris Agreement without the DoD's past, ongoing, and future contributions to this effort. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to recognize this fact and support my amendment. This is very simple. This is an opportunity for a win-win-win, which is often hard to come by these days. But this is good for the American taxpayer. It will save us hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars by promoting these efforts and increasing energy resiliency and efficiency. It's a win for our national security because it's one of our largest vulnerabilities. Our bases are subject to cyber attack and are very vulnerable to continuity decreases in our operations. And it's a win for the environment. This is something that we have to do. We have an obligation to do in support of our national security. And again, I would urge everyone to join in supporting this amendment. Mr. Chair, I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Colorado yields back. The gentleman from Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I want to make sure I also thank my colleague for his service. I too, having served in the Army Infantry during the Cold War, there's the Banda brothers, and we do appreciate your service to the country. Also, we do appreciate that the National Defense Authorization Act passed in the last Congress has been helpful. So that's another example of it wasn't couched in climate change, but it was couched in national defense. And that's where, again, I will continue to make the arguments and the comments that things have been going on, and I don't want to read the full list of bills and stuff that that we have passed over the last Congress. The military is also looking at small modular nuclear reactors in some isolated locations. That will be part of the issues that in the innovation area that Republicans could be very, very supportive of. And we look forward to having those debates. I also know in forward operating bases of solar technology and solar power helps keep our warfighters prepared and able to communicate. So, and it's just the smart thing to do versus trying to haul crude oil or generators and stuff to places where it would be not in the best interest of our warfighters to have. So the focus is good. The Republicans, again, believe in conservation, innovation, and adaptation, and go through those buckets. When we move a bill that will get a chance to be heard by the Senate, and that we work together the goal would be to get something on the president's desk that he'll sign. This is not the venue because he's not. The Senate's not going to move it. The president's not going to sign it. But I would encourage my colleagues to stay engaged, not just with the Armed Services Committee, but the Energy and Commerce Committee and colleagues on this side, because I do think there's a merit to the debate and really an acknowledgement of what the Department of Defense has done with focus by the previous commander-in-chief. The Paris climate mandates instituted by the Obama administration through the Paris Agreement and the outdated executive order would have increased energy prices and wasted taxpayers' dollars. As a result, we cannot support the amendment that would condone and reinstitute some of these costly measures. So that I would ask my colleagues to vote no on the amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider amendment number 29, printed in House Report 116-42. Does the gentleman from New York rise as the designee of the gentleman from California?
Yes.
For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk made in order by the rule.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 29, printed in House Report number 116-42, offered by Mr. Engel of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 329, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Engel, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
I thank you and want to say very strongly that on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee and also the Energy and Commerce Committee, we support this amendment. It's a very good amendment, and the Paris Agreement signed in 2015 is the first truly universal agreement among nations to tackle climate change, and rarely is there consensus among nearly all nations on a single topic. But with the Paris Agreement, leaders from around the world collectively agreed that climate change is driven by human behavior, that it's a threat to the environment and all of humanity, and that global action is needed to stop it. It also created a clear framework for all countries to make emissions reduction commitments. At present, 197 countries, every nation on Earth, with the last signatory being war-torn Syria, have adopted the Paris Agreement. And this agreement includes a series of mandatory measures for the monitoring, verification, and public reporting of progress towards a country's emission reduction targets. But the emission reduction targets themselves are voluntary. Each nation sets their own, respectful of national sovereignty, and there's no penalty for missing the targets. The idea is to create a culture of accountability and maybe some peer pressure to get countries to reduce emissions. I now yield to the gentleman from California, Mr. Cox, the author of this amendment.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm honored to be here today to introduce my amendment, H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act. My amendment takes into consideration the various populations, regions, industries, and communities affected by climate change, while reducing any possible impacts on American jobs. We all know that climate change has impacted countries, communities throughout our country, and the world. Over the past few years, we've seen the devastating effects on the waters of the Caribbean Sea, fueling powerful storms like Hurricane Maria, which devastated Puerto Rico and took the lives of close to 3,000 people, and displacing another 300,000 from their homes. In my home state of California last year, it led to the deadliest wildfire season in history. And according to the National Climate Assessment, rural communities, like the ones I serve, face challenging obstacles in responding to climate change because they're so highly dependent on natural resources. My constituents, the people of California's Central Valley, live in one of the most economically distressed parts of our country. We have been forgotten and left behind, but it is my constituents who have seen the direct impacts of climate change with our recent heat waves and droughts. And it's only going to get worse if we don't work together and address this issue head on. H.R. 9 is the first step we must take in addressing this challenge, and this would prohibit federal funds from being used to take any action in advancing the withdrawal of the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. The U.S. committed to joining the Paris Agreement because we're a leading nation, and it's unfortunate that this president is taking us backward. Instead of fighting climate change, the president and this administration have proposed to slash funding from the Department of Energy's efficiency and renewable energy offices by over 85%. And they even proposed to cut energy funding from our states. My amendment would help create a clean energy economy that would provide good paying jobs to millions of Americans, cleaner air for everyone, and a safe, sustainable future for our children and grandchildren. What we continue to hear from our Republican colleagues is that a number of coal jobs will be taken away from Americans. And I can tell you, as somebody who's worked in the mining industry, who has worked underground, I know it's not the way to go. And while we know that mining jobs and underground jobs are honorable jobs that provide for families, at one time so was whaling. But we need to be innovative and looking towards the future. The more time we waste on clinging to jobs of the past, the more time we waste in making progress. Nationally, there are over 240,000 jobs in the solar industry alone, and only about 53,000 coal mining jobs. And reports find that the Paris Agreement would create and generate over 24 million jobs worldwide. In the state of California, we have over 519,000 clean energy jobs. And it's critical, more than ever, that we continue to connect workers to jobs, to these jobs that we're creating for the 21st century. My amendment does just that by requiring any climate plan to consider the impact on jobs, wages, and pay. And we have the opportunity to be global leaders in the clean energy economy, ensure that so many of these jobs are created right here in the United States, not in other countries, not in India, not in China. And we cannot afford to take steps back in the fight on climate change. We must keep our word to the rest of the world. So I urge my colleagues to support my amendment, and I yield the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New York controls the time? Oh,
I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Illinois. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek
To
recognition?
claim time in opposition, and I reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman has the only time that remains.
So they yield it back.
As the gentleman from New York's time has expired.
Okay,
Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, when I have a chance, I wanted to make sure I got submitted this statement into the record, or I'm just going to read it. This is from the International Energy Agency, Global Energy and CO2 Status Report 2018, published March of 2019, so it's fresh, pretty much fresh off the press. It addresses some of these issues that I've mentioned during this debate today about how we have been doing things, how overall emissions are decreasing, and how public policy has helped in the like. So one of the paragraphs I'd like to read is, in the United States, and this is on page 10, in the United States, the emission reductions seen in 2017 were reversed with an increase of 3.1% in CO2 emissions in 2018. That's what we addressed about the economy going up, more CO2 emissions. Despite this increase, emissions in the United States remain around their 1990 levels. 14% and 800 metric tons of CO2 below their peak in 2000. This is the largest absolute decline among all countries since 2000. So I think that's instructive when we're here debating a bill that's not going to be reviewed by the Senate. The president's not going to sign it. We look forward to working with my colleagues on Energy and Commerce on things that we can do to work together to make better strides than what we already have in this country. We don't get a lot of credit because we don't couch it in, as I've said before, Mr. Chairman, climate change, Paris Accord. But facts are important, data is important, and the Energy Information Agency is an independent agency underneath the Department of Commerce. So it's evaluating all countries and all emissions. Republicans believe in conservation, which would be energy efficiency, new source review, forest management, innovation, advanced nuclear power, carbon capture, sequestration, utilization. The colleague who brought the amendment up, I don't believe coal will be dead. I think if we bring technology and we use carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration and get it captured, we can still have a coal mining sector. We can still have energy, electricity generated by coal. I hope so, because I'm from a coal mining region. I'm not going to walk away from the jobs in Southern Illinois. And the adaptation, which we've had a lot of debate about today, which is grid modernization, resiliency, crops, and the like. The amendment of my colleague is opposite to what Dr. Burgess and I tried to do in the committee when we marked up this bill. We wanted to have the research and the analysis done before we go back to a climate agreement. I mean, what good does it do if you go to an agreement and then you find that jobs have been lost, wages have gone down? It's too late. You're in the agreement. So let's do the research prior, which was our amendment. It wasn't made in order for the floor, Dr. Burgess and I, to say, let's do this research. So if we're going to move and go back into the climate Paris Accord, if we're going to affect jobs in the economy negatively, we should know that beforehand. This amendment does not do that. So with that, I would ask a no vote on this amendment, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields. The question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York will be postponed. The committee will rise informally to receive a message.
The House will be in order, and the chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, a message from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary, the committee will...
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed S-406 to establish a federal rotational cyber workforce program for the federal cyber workforce, in which the concurrence of the House is requested.
The committee will resume its sitting.
The committee will be in order. It is now in order to consider amendment number 30, printed in House Report 116-42. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 30, printed in House Report number 116-42, offered by Mr. Krishnamurthy of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 329, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, and I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of amendment number 30 to the Climate Action Now Act. We are already seeing the economic benefits of taking action on climate change. In the United States, we have already created millions, I say millions of jobs in the clean economy, from installing wind turbines and solar panels to retrofitting buildings to making them more efficient, energy efficient, to assembling fuel efficient vehicles and manufacturing the component parts for all of these clean energies, technologies that can help drive down emissions. My amendment acknowledges the important role clean energy jobs play in meeting the United States commitment under the Paris Agreement. There are currently more than 500,000 jobs in the renewable energy industry alone. Just an example of the millions of jobs we are creating in the clean economy as we work to meet our emissions reductions target. By taking a leadership role in global climate action, we can harness these benefits and see even more economic growth and opportunities for communities everywhere, including in Southern Illinois. And we need to make sure we do this in a way that not only creates jobs, but creates good family-sustaining jobs for working families throughout the country, including in my home state of Illinois and in the 8th District of Illinois. Economic growth, workforce development, and climate leadership go hand in hand. As co-founder and co-chair of the Bipartisan Congressional Solar Caucus, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. And at this time, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from New York for 30 seconds to speak on this amendment.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 30 seconds.
I thank my friend for yielding, and I want to say unequivocally on behalf of the Foreign Affairs Committee and the Energy and Commerce Committee, we strongly support this amendment. It's an excellent amendment, and I also want to thank the gentleman for working with the committees on this amendment. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Northern Illinois.
Thank you for your excellent remarks. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Southern Illinois seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I claim time in opposition and would like to reserve my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Northern Illinois.
I have no further comments.
Does the gentleman yield?
I yield back.
The gentleman yields. The gentleman from Southern Illinois is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that's the first time I've been directed to my region of the state of Illinois, and I appreciate it. Illinois has 102 counties. I represent 33 of those, or parts of 33. So it is a little different than north of I-80, as you as the chairman knows, and as the author of this amendment. And of course, you have me at a disadvantage because I have great kinship and friendship with my colleague who is offering this amendment. I would pause to say sometimes we have a hard time defining clean. What is clean energy? For me, and for some of this debate is no CO2 or very limited CO2 emissions. I think that's in the Paris Accord, in the climate change, global warming debate. It's all about CO2. I mean, we've had some colleagues come here and talk about the 4 criteria pollutants and stuff, but this is really about CO2. So we also think that in not just solar, but we ought to make sure we do geothermal provisions. We ought to look at pump storage provisions. We should do the hydroelectric provisions. And as my colleague knows, Mr. Chairman, and you know, being in the Chicagoland area, Illinois is the largest production of electricity through the use of nuclear power. 6 locations, 11 reactors. How much does it emit of CO2 into the atmosphere? 0. Major base load energy that's beneficial in this debate, because we can't meet these standards unless we have some major generation, some major base load. And so I think we would have, if we look forward to moving forward in a bill that would have a chance to move to the Senate floor, that we eventually want to get to the president, we actually look forward to working with you on provisions and helping us grapple with the definition of clean. And if the definition is little to no CO2 emissions, solar is great. Wind is great. They're small parts of a large portfolio of nuclear energy and hydroelectric, which are the predominant clean energy electricity producers, if that definition is CO2. So with that, I would ask my colleagues to vote no on the amendment respectfully, and yield back my time.
The gentlemen from Illinois have both yielded, and the question is now on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Illinois. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Okay. And are these all? Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in House Report 116-42, on which further proceedings were postponed in the following order. Amendment number 2 by Mr. Espaillat of New York. Amendment number 10 by Mr. Gosar of Arizona. Amendment number 11 by Mr. Gosar of Arizona. Amendment number 14 by Ms. Porter of California. Amendment number 22 by Ms. Fletcher of Texas. Amendment number 24 by Ms. Schreier of Washington. Amendment number 26 by Mr. Van Drew of New Jersey. And amendment number 29 by Mr. Engel of New York. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is the request for a recorded vote on amendment number 2, printed in House Report 116-42 by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Espaillat, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the ayes prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in House Report number 116-42, offered by Mr. Espaillat of New York.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their vote by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
For the past couple of days, the House has been debating climate change legislation in the form of a bill that would keep the U.S. in the Paris Climate Agreement. Well, shortly after taking office, President Trump decided and announced that the U.S. would no longer be a part of that agreement beginning in the year 2020. The bill also requires the president to craft a plan determining how the U.S. will implement the lower greenhouse gas levels that were set forth in the Paris Accord. Yesterday, members began debating the 30 amendments offered on the bill. They finished amendment debate and now votes here on the remaining amendments and on passage, beginning with an amendment that is co-authored by Congressman Espaillat of New York, which would include findings addressing the importance of climate justice and environmental justice. This is the first vote in this series. It's a 15-minute vote. Should know that we are expecting House Speaker Nancy Pelosi to start her weekly briefing with reporters, scheduled to start at 10:45, so it could happen any moment now. We plan to have it for you here on C-SPAN when it gets underway. Until then, a look at some of the floor debate on the Paris climate bill from yesterday.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong support of H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act. I shouldn't need to persuade anyone in this chamber that we desperately need to take serious action on climate change. Just look at the news. We are already seeing the consequences of our inaction. Natural disasters, famines, instability, human suffering. The time for action to avoid the worst effects of climate change is rapidly closing. We must demonstrate to the rest of the world and to future generations that we're still committed to taking on this fight. Climate change is a national security threat that transcends borders and requires international coordination. That's why it's so critical that we work shoulder to shoulder with our friends and partners around the world. Is the driver of extreme weather and natural disaster.
Said, I'll say it again, we're going to be putting together.
seeking the Democratic nomination for president. Comments coming a day after determine how the U.S. will implement the lower green
purposes.
So do I gavel? Those opposed, amendment reported from the Committee of the Whole? If not, the chair will put them in gross. The question is on the adoption of the amendments. Those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The amendments are agreed to. The question is on engrossment and the third reading of the bill. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. The ayes have it. Third reading.
A bill to direct the president to develop a plan for the United States to meet its nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement and for other purposes.
So do I gavel? The House will be in order. Gavel. The House will be in order. Members, please clear the well. Take your conversations off the out of the House floor, please. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I have a motion to recommit at the desk.
Is the gentleman opposed to the bill?
I am in its current form.
The gentleman qualifies. The clerk will report the motion.
Mr. Barr of Kentucky moves to recommit the bill, H.R. 9, to the Committee on Foreign Affairs with instructions to report the same back to the House forthwith with the following amendment. At the end of the bill, add the following new section, Section 6, effective date. This act shall take effect on the date that the President certifies that meeting the nationally determined contribution of the United States under the Paris Agreement will not result in a net transfer of jobs from the United States to China.
The House will be in order. Members, the House will be in order. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, this is the final amendment to the bill. It would not kill the bill or send it back to committee. If adopted, the bill would immediately proceed to final passage as amended. This motion makes a small but important change to the bill, a change that is necessary to preserve the economic strength of the United States. The amendment simply states that the act shall not take effect until the President certifies that the United States will not, on net, lose jobs to China as a result of meeting the emissions commitments required under the Paris Agreement. If, as the majority believes, the Paris Agreement will improve America's economic and technological competitiveness, this should not be a problem. Madam Speaker, I do not disagree with my colleagues that climate change is a problem that this nation and other nations need to address. In fact, I believe it's important that we continue to have discussions about serious solutions on how to mitigate these risks through American innovation, conservation, adaptation, and preparation. But Madam Speaker, H.R. 9 is not a serious solution to these problems. The truth of the matter is, the Paris Agreement would hurt our economy, cost millions of American jobs, weaken our sovereignty, and put us at a disadvantage among international competitors, especially China. My home state of Kentucky relies heavily on fossil fuels, and the coal industry provides our state with thousands of jobs and delivers over 83%.
In order. The gentleman may proceed.
The coal industry in Kentucky provides our state with thousands of jobs and delivers over 83% of our power. This enables Kentuckians to enjoy some of the lowest cost electricity rates in the country. And Kentucky is not the only state that relies on carbon-based fuels for its energy. Nationally, our energy mix is made up of about 80% fossil fuels, as compared to only 5% intermittent and unreliable sources such as solar and wind. Let's think about the feasibility of hitting the goals outlined in the Paris Agreement to cut greenhouse emissions by 26 to 28% by 2025, or to push the debate even further, those goals outlined in the Democrats' other climate proposals, such as the Green New Deal,
to eliminate fossil fuels completely. A proposal that just yesterday, every member of the majority voted against bringing up for debate. That's because the Green New Deal is nothing more than an absurd socialist fantasy that would devastate our economy. As policymakers, our goal should not be to embrace at all costs the most green energy. Our goal should be to promote the best energy, the most effective energy, the most reliable energy, and the most affordable energy. Now, despite massive technological advances and innovations, any drastic move away from fossil fuel consumption is dangerous. It would mean increased energy prices and decreased reliability. Household electricity expenditures would increase up to 20%. It would mean manufacturing and energy-intensive jobs moving offshore. On average, we would see a shortfall of nearly 200,000 manufacturing jobs and 400,000 jobs overall. It would mean economic decline and stagnation in communities, yielding an aggregate GDP loss of over $2.5 trillion and a total income loss for a family of four of over $20,000. It is only common sense that we ensure that these economic outcomes will never come to fruition before entering into this agreement, which is what this simple amendment would do. Remember, between 2000 and 2014, the United States reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 18% without being subject to any international agreement. We should continue to focus on reducing emissions, developing and exporting clean coal technologies, and making our communities more resilient. But 1,000 more pages in the Federal Register will not change the weather. Scientific and technological innovation fueled through free enterprise can. Finally, if we want to be serious about a global solution to climate change, we need to address the world's largest carbon emission offenders who have refused to meet the agreement's goals. This agreement fails to address those real polluters. China, the #1 country in the world for greenhouse gas emissions, is perhaps our greatest strategic economic adversary. It is a nation that has been growing in manufacturing and industrial dominance. Under the Paris Agreement, China has been allowed to increase emissions until 2030. This gives China a leg up. They'll spend that decade stealing our jobs. That hits people in my district the hardest. It hits those who can least afford it. As we confront China economically, we must be sure our environmental goals do not put us at a strategic disadvantage or force us to commit economic self-destruction. We must ensure that our policies do not raise electric rates and drive energy-intensive businesses offshore. And we must make sure that China, with its rapacious appetite for dominating all industry and sweeping efforts to steal U.S. ideas, does not have new reasons to take advantage of American workers.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Madam Speaker, socialism and central planning never will solve the problems of the human race. Vote yes on the motion to recommit.
The House will be in order. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to the motion.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Madam Speaker, our Republican colleagues are right about one thing. China is taking advantage of us, but it's not taking advantage of America being in the Paris Accord. It's taking advantage of our retreat. China is a strategic competitor, and it should pain all of us that everywhere around the world, China is being treated like the leader in fighting climate change. It should pain us that China is investing more money in renewable energy than any other country. It should pain us that they are surging ahead of us in electric vehicles. It should pain us that they are racing to dominate the global market in lithium batteries, that they have 2/3 of the world's high-speed rail and have spent over $100 billion on it in 2018. Why is China spending hundreds of billions of dollars to make the transition to clean energy? Let me tell you, it's not because the Chinese Communist Party loves trees. It's because they want to win the future. I want America to win the future. I want us to reap the economic benefits and the jobs that will go to whoever wins the race to a clean energy future. And how do our Republican colleagues propose to win that race? I have looked at their record. In the years when they controlled this House, I searched in vain for one free market-based plan. What did I find? Nothing. apart from a tax bill filled with giveaways to oil companies, to allow more oil drilling, legislation to allow methane emissions, to gut the Clean Air Act, to roll back the Clean Power Plan. That's it. That's all you did. And do you know who has left you behind? Do you know who wants us to stay in the Paris Accord because they know that our economic future depends on it? I'll tell you who. The Dow Chemical Company wants us to stay in Paris. Bank of America wants us to stay. DuPont wants us to stay. Procter & Gamble wants us to stay. General Electric wants us to stay. Cargill wants us to stay. Citigroup wants us to stay. Johnson & Johnson wants us to stay. Coca-Cola wants us to stay. ExxonMobil wants us to stay. The Walt Disney Company wants us to stay. Not a lot of socialists on their board. Though I do have my doubts about Goofy from time to time. So that's our choice. We can cling to the past, we can let China win this race, or we can stand with our American companies, our American scientists, our American innovators, and let them lead us into the future. Madam Speaker, I yield to the gentleman from South Carolina.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. As a former ocean engineer, I rise on behalf of South Carolina's 1st Congressional District, the Low Country. And I rise, quite frankly, as someone who typically votes with Republicans on these motions. But not today. I'd hope that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle would want to engage in a constructive dialogue that addresses the devastating impacts of flooding, intensifying storms, and rising sea levels. But not today. This is not the way that it used to be. President Teddy Roosevelt established 150 national forests and 5 national parks. President Reagan signed into law 38 bills that added more than 10.6 million acres to the National Wilderness Preservation System, all with the support of the distinguished members of the Grand Old Party. But not today. The Grand Old Party has an illustrious history with environmental conservation, a history it should be proud of. But not today. This Republican body does a disservice to that environmental record by turning a blind eye to science and facts. There are certain things that go beyond politics, impacts that touch each and every one of us, regardless of partisanship, regardless of ideology. Climate change is one of them. The Low Country knows this more than most. In downtown Charleston, our medical district, which is home to Charleston's VA hospital and our medical university, is the area that is most prone to flooding.
The gentleman will suspend. Colleagues, the House is not in order. The gentleman may proceed.
During a recent hurricane, the Medical University of South Carolina was forced to float surgeons across the campus in John boats to treat patients, including our veterans and our children. Parris Island, which is one of the only 2 bases that makes enlisted Marines, and the only base that makes female enlisted Marines in our country. Parris Island, Madam Speaker, Parris Island could be flooded. Oh, Madam Speaker.
Your time has expired. The gentleman's time has expired.
The House is not in order. Bring this House to order.
Order, please. The gentleman's time has expired. The chair will remind all persons in the gallery that they are here as guests of the House and that any manifestation of approval or disapproval of proceedings is in violation of the rules of the House. Without objection. The previous question is ordered on the motion to recommit. The question is on the motion to recommit. Those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, please say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman has requested a recorded vote. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, the chair will reduce to 5 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote on the question of passage. This is a 5-minute vote.
The House voting now on a motion to recommit, attempting to send a bill back to committee for more debate. Republicans, under the motion to recommit, want to change the Paris Climate Agreement legislation they've been considering to ensure jobs are not lost to China in its implementation. A vote on passage could follow. The House will not be in session tomorrow, so these are the last two votes of the day and for the week. This is a 5-minute vote. The House Judiciary Committee was expected to hear testimony this morning from Attorney General William Barr. He made it clear yesterday that he was not planning to come to the Hill if Democrat staff attorneys would be called to question him. The hearing commenced anyway as scheduled, but without the Attorney General. Committee leaders gave opening statements, and then they called the hearing to a close. It lasted no more than 20 minutes, and you can see the entire proceedings, such as they were, on our website, C-SPAN.
And further, when the House adjourns on that day, it adjourns to meet at noon.
On this vote, the yeas are 231 and the nays are 190. The bill is passed. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. The chair lays before the House an enrolled bill.
H.R. 1222, an act to amend the Pittman-Robertson Wildlife Restoration Act to facilitate the establishment of additional or expanded public target ranges in certain states.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on the Judiciary be discharged from further consideration of H.R. 962, the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
Under guidelines consistently issued by successive speakers as recorded in Section 956 of the House Rules and Manual, the chair is constrained not to entertain the request unless it has been cleared by the bipartisan floor and committee leaderships. And has not been recognized.
To say the House will be in order.
States
Technology at scene, we actually need teeth. We need and the
debate and interesting in the world. Debate and interesting vote.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
We had an interesting debate and interesting vote today regarding the Paris climate change agreement that it is a treaty. Hadn't been properly treated like a treaty, just like the Iran treaty was a treaty. And no matter whether the House or the Senate agreed to violate the Constitution and treat the Iran treaty in exactly the opposite format as required by the Constitution. Doesn't matter. It was a treaty. It was never properly ratified. Doesn't matter whether it was a Republican or a Democrat that came up with the bill. It was a Republican. A senator or a House member cannot come up with a bill that changes the Constitution and said, you know what, we're going to take this treaty and act like you have to have 2/3 vote it down instead of 2/3 to ratify it. But that's what they did. So the president did exactly the right thing. It was time to stop giving billions of dollars in both direct money aid to the largest sponsor of terrorism, Iran. And it was also time to reimpose the sanctions that had basically brought Iran to its knees, begging for help. Well, the Obama administration helped them in two ways. Number one, allowing them to pursue nuclear capabilities, just doing it privately. I'm one of three people that met with the two main inspectors from the IAEA over in Europe, and regarding the question of, and they would issue the statement each time that they had seen no evidence that Iran was developing nukes. But in response to the question, did you see the military facilities that they keep so hidden and secret and where their nuclear development would be occurring? And they said, no, they gave us a video that they said came from there, but we've never been allowed to examine the facilities. So the IAEA was not allowed to examine the facilities where the nuclear development, nuclear weapons would have been developed, probably were being developed. And from Iran's standpoint, based on how ridiculous the agreement was, they certainly, and knowing their mentality of cheating, certainly they would have been pursuing nuclear weapons. Whether or not they would wait for 10 years before actually going public with actually having nuclear weapons. But I even asked, okay, the Obama administration sent them $150 billion in cash. Let's say hypothetically, Iran decided we will just take some of that $150 billion and buy us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 nukes from North Korea, from Pakistan. We know that during those final years of the Obama administration that Iran had met with Pakistani officials, with North Korean officials. So that was certainly a possibility, but I wondered if the IAEA had a capability of noting and discovering if Iran were to import a nuclear weapon from, say, North Korea or Russia or Pakistan. And apparently, unless the Iranians brought their new nuclear weapons immediately near the detection equipment, there would be no way to know that Iran bought nuclear weapons. So to anyone who used reason in dealing with the largest supporter of terrorism in the world, responsible for killing so many precious American military members and others, President Trump did a great thing. He did the right thing. It was a great thing to do for America's future safety. It was a great thing to do for the world's safety. And it was absolutely a helpful thing to do for the nation of Israel. So that was smart. we've had these different climate accords, and what so many of them have in common basically was, gee, we will pay the world lots of money, supposedly some type of guilt money, even though we have been more philanthropic than any other country in the history of the world. And to any astute eye examining the state of the world and world history, it becomes very clear the only countries that are able to do anything about pollution on the planet are countries that have a strong, vibrant economy. Countries that are struggling, you know, they're doing all they can to put people to work, to survive. They just can't spare the money to clean up the environment. You got countries like China and India, massive polluters, and under these accords, heck, China wouldn't even have requirements kick in for them to clean things up till 2030, and by then there would be all new agreements that would probably give China even more time. These accords appeared to be geared for one thing: do damage to the economy of the one country that's doing so much to clean up carbon emissions, to clean up pollution. Article here back from Forbes, this was back fall of 2017. Yes, the U.S. leads all countries in reducing carbon emissions. And, you know, that was 10 months into the Obama administration. But as the Environmental Protection Agency announced, we are leading the nation, we're leading the world with respect to our CO2 footprint in reductions. The Washington Post fact-checked this claim and rated it 3 Pinocchios, which means they rate the claim mostly false. They further wrote, Pruitt's usage of data appeared to be a deliberate effort to mislead the public, but the data mostly supports Pruitt's claim. You have to consider the source, just like during my days on the bench, as felony judge, major civil litigation. It was all about the credibility of the witness. And as we've seen, the Washington Post is exceedingly biased, slanted in their reporting. And so we need a source that gives Pinocchios to the Washington Post. Because if you look at the 2017 BP Statistical Review of World Energy, since 2005, annual U.S. carbon dioxide emissions have declined by 758 million metric tons. That is by far the largest decline of any country in the world over that time span, and is nearly as large as the 770 million metric ton decline for the entire European Union. By comparison, the second largest decline during that period was registered by the United Kingdom, which reported 170 million metric ton decline. So we had 758 million metric ton decline in carbon emissions in that year, and UK was second, not quite up to our 758 million metric tons. They were at 170 million metric ton decline. But at the same time, China's carbon dioxide emissions grew by 3 billion metric tons, and India's grew by 1 billion metric tons. So we're over here in the United States trying not to destroy our economy, and yet cleaning up the environment more than anybody else in the world. And this ridiculous accord, really a treaty, allows the biggest polluters in the world to keep polluting much more, just either one of those, than the rest of the world. It's just phenomenal. The article goes on. The Washington Post gets into per capita emissions, and indeed, despite the decline, the U.S. per capita emissions are still among highest in the world. However, the Washington Post story claimed, quote, the United States may have had the largest decrease in carbon emissions, but is still the largest per capita emitter. That's not accurate either. According to the World Bank data, U.S. per capita carbon dioxide emissions rank 11th among countries. So we are not the largest per capita emitter, but we do emit 2.2 times as much on a per capita basis as China. But China has 4.3 times as many people, and that matters from an overall emissions perspective. China's lower per capita carbon dioxide emissions are more than offset by its greater population. So China emits over 70% more carbon dioxide annually than the United States. So there's a lot of manipulation as to what's going on, but it's ridiculous for the United States to be part of a treaty in which the United States is punished and our economy punished and the American people punished, even though we are cutting the carbon dioxide emissions more than anyone else. Another article from Liz Peek on the Hill, China's rising emissions prove Trump right on the Paris Agreement. And this article is from last year. That nothing horrifies the intelligentsia more than President Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement on climate change. But based on new information on China's emissions, it increasingly looks like the president made the right call. Just last week, an analysis from Greenpeace indicated that China's 2018, and the numbers we were quoting before were from the year before, but indicated China's 2018 carbon emissions were on a track to grow at the fastest rate in 6 years. The study, based on government data regarding the use of coal and other energy sources, shows carbon output rising 4% in the first quarter of this year. Analysts are projecting similar gains over the next several quarters. The weakness of the Paris Agreement was that it was lopsided, requiring little from China and a great deal from the U.S. President Obama, committed to the United States to reducing carbon emissions in 2025 by 26 to 28%, which would have meant a substantial jump in electricity costs. By contrast, China committed to boosting non-fossil fuels to around 20% of its overall energy mix by 2030, and a hope that emissions might peak at that time. As one analyst commented in the New York Times, quote, what China is pledging to do here is not a lot different from what China's policies are on track to deliver. So the president really did do the right thing for the American public. We lost a great man, a former member of this body, and John Dingell. He and I had disagreements over some issues, but I knew John Dingell. I knew and I know he was an honest man. He was an honorable man. He was a very decent man. He was a genuine asset to this legislative body. He followed the rules. He made others follow the rules. And yet he was removed as chairman of Energy and Commerce, even though he was looking forward to working diligently on a health care bill. he was removed as chairman of the committee because he made a statement that can still be found on YouTube. Like I said, he was an honest man. He did not want to move the cap and trade bill out of his committee. As he said, a cap and trade bill is basically a big thing, and it was a carbon tax. He said that cap and trade bill is not only a tax, it's a great big one. And he had talked about how when you skyrocket the cost of energy, you know, the rich people are inconvenienced, but it's the poor in the nation. It's the lower middle class. It's the senior citizens on a fixed income, on Social Security, where they may go for years without getting a cost of living increase. And even if they get one, it doesn't keep up with skyrocketing energy costs. And he could not abide hurting poor people, hardworking, lower middle class people with skyrocketing energy that they couldn't afford to pay. And that's where so many of these things lead. If we're going to have compassion on the people that are the working poor, for heaven's sake, the last thing you want to do to them is skyrocket the cost of what they absolutely have to have just to exist. In America today, you've got to have energy. Whether it's electric energy, whether it's natural gas energy, gasoline, diesel, you've got to have energy. Even a wood-burning stove, you've got to have energy. And these kind of bills that push for these kind of efforts devastate the working poor in this country. So here's an article from Justin Sykes. It also is from 2017, but analyzing Obama's Paris Agreement, and the title says, "All Cost and No Benefit for the United States." So I am pleased that President Trump withdrew us from the treaty that was never properly ratified and that would continue to send jobs to China and India from the United States. We have a president who understands before America can continue to be the most philanthropic country in the world, helping those less fortunate, you need a vibrant economy, and simply bringing the U.S. economy down to the almost no rate of growth during the Obama years is not going to help us help other countries. So the economy, some may recall, you can go back and see President Obama talking in terms of basically the 3% growth is a thing of the past. Economy can't grow that. We need to get used to the new normal. Well, under this president, the new normal is over 3% growth. And the only chance we have to overcome our massive deficit and growing deficit is to get the economy going so strongly that it grows in enough sufficient manner that we are able to start paying down our deficit if we will just quit the massive overspending. Now, we have had quite a show, really more of a circus, in our Judiciary Committee the last couple of days. It's really been outrageous. The Judiciary Committee ought to be, if anything, the last bastion of civility in this town. Judiciary Committee should be the committee from which good rules emanate that inspire others in the country and around the world, that we have a model that can be followed. And what occurred in our Judiciary Committee in the last 2 days has made a mockery of the legislative process. And something that our committee, under our new majority, Democrat majority, has not been willing to focus on, that is a threat to our First, Second, Fourth, Fifth Amendment rights, is the overreach by the Department of Justice, by the FBI, potentially by the intel community, in taking away Americans' right to have privacy in their phone conversations, in their emails, their right to have a court system in which the judges are not closer to being the prosecutor than they are actual even-handed judges. And one of the things that is a huge concern, for me, should be a huge concern for all Americans. I know it used to be a big concern with our now chairman, Nadler. I know my first term here in 05 and 06. At that time, Congressman Nadler was a great stalwart in pushing for privacy rights and civil liberties to make sure the government under the Bush administration didn't overreach. But an interesting thing happened on the way to their majority and having the Obama administration in charge. There seemed to be a complete loss of interest in protecting civil liberties of people whom the Obama administration chose to spy on. And I know that the Attorney General has said he's going to be following up with critically important investigations now, but I would hope, and maybe the majority just really doesn't want to protect Americans' rights, more focused on trying to destroy the current president, but there are things that have now arisen. Evidence is clear. Massive, widespread abuse at the top of the FBI, top of the DOJ, potentially in the intel area. And even to the point that we would have a special prosecutor, Robert Mueller, who, in the words of Wilford Brimley, once said, "Last time we had a leak like this, Noah built himself an ark." And that seems to be what has happened under Mueller's watch when he was at the FBI, under Mueller's watch as a special counsel. And a good example is in this article from BuzzFeed. They're certainly no fan of mine, but the editor, the news editor-in-chief, Ben Smith, has this article from April 18th, 2019. And in this article, he says, our reporters, talking about the BuzzFeed reporters, went back to the two senior law enforcement sources who had told them, as the article put it, that, quote, Donald Trump directed his longtime attorney, Michael Cohen, to lie to Congress about negotiations to build a Trump Tower in Moscow, according to two federal law enforcement officials involved in an investigation of the matter, unquote. That means that's got to be a couple of people on the Mueller team leaking information that turns out was not accurate, but leaking information for one reason, obviously, since it turned out not to be accurate, to do harm to the President of the United States. That is not the job of the Department of Justice or the FBI. Further down in the article, it says, and this is the news editor-in-chief talking at BuzzFeed, our story was based on detailed information from senior law enforcement sources. That reporting included documents specifically, and get this, specifically pages of notes that were taken during an interview of Cohen by the FBI. Now, we got to looking at this issue back regarding witness statements that are taken down by the FBI, and it's really time that the FBI came on up into the 20th century, the latter half of the 20th century. I'm not even asking them to come to the 21st century, but a practice of the FBI has been, and it's advantageous to law enforcement that does this. It's not really honorable, but it is advantageous. They don't like to film or record statements made by witnesses. They prefer to have an FBI agent take notes of their interpretation of what the witness is saying. If they recorded it by video or audio tape, then when there was a question, well, which is right, the FBI agent's notes or the actual words coming from the witness's mouth, then you could go to the tape and find out which was actually accurate. But when there is no recording, then the advantage goes strictly, and you're strictly to the benefit of the government agent because, gee, they've got no convictions. They come into court. I saw so many felonies being tried in my court. I've tried felonies many times. But you know which way the jury is normally going to go. They're going to believe the law enforcement officer, especially prior to the last few years, back when the FBI had a much higher, well thought of reputation, been devastated in recent years, but they come in and testify, and the witness says, that's not what I said. You don't get to see a video. You don't get to hear the audio of what the witness actually said. What you have to decide between is this FBI agent that's never been convicted and looks good on the stand, sounds good on the stand, and this defendant that probably has a criminal record. So that usually goes in the direction of the FBI agent. But now most state and local law enforcement offices have done more and more to record statements, to record what happens so that juries can see for themselves. So they don't have to judge between the credibility of the law enforcement or a defendant. They see for themselves, they hear for themselves what was said or done. The FBI doesn't like to do that. They much prefer to have agents make their notes of their interpretation of what the defendant said. And Mueller particularly loved that during his 12 years as director of the FBI, because his people always got the benefit of the doubt, and they were able to convict people because the FBI agent, who may have completely misinterpreted what was said in his or her notes, they get the benefit and the defendant gets convicted. So that's been a great strategy for law enforcement. Some people felt like I was a hang 'em high type felony judge, but I wanted fairness. We got to have fairness. And because of the credibility issues of the FBI, I feel comfortable Christopher Wray won't do it. He's more interested in trying to rebuild the image of the FBI without actually correcting anything. So I'm sure he's correcting some things, but certainly he's not changing 302, the witness statements taken down in writing as the FBI agent's interpretation. And there are other indications he's more interested in trying to have a good front, making it look like the FBI is better now. But there are actions that do need to be taken. But this story, going back to it, that reporting included documents, specifically pages of notes that were taken during an interview of Cohen by the FBI. In those notes, one law enforcement source wrote that, quote, DJT personally asked Cohen to say negotiations ended in January, and White House counsel office knew Cohen would give false testimony to Congress. Sanctioned by DJT, joint lawyer team reviewed letter Cohen sent to SSCI about his testimony about Trump Tower Moscow et al., knowing it contained lies. Well, it turns out those notes that were taken by FBI agents were not accurate, which again causes problems for credibility. But the real problem is the fact that you had investigators, which must have been FBI, working for the Mueller team, and they're turning over documents that at least were law enforcement sensitive, and they're probably classified to some level. And as we know, as people looked into it after former FBI Director Comey basically admitted a crime, that he had leaked information that he had taken down or typed up in a memo based on his conversation with the president. Well, under the FBI rules and regulations, that's not his property. It's not to be leaked. And yet he leaked it to a professor friend so that the professor friend could get it out to the press. I think it was the New York Times. But regardless, get it out to the press for the sole purpose of trying to get a special counsel appointed to harass President Trump. So you've got the former FBI director. What kind of example was that? Comey's knowingly leaking information that was potentially criminal to leak. And so when you have the FBI director potentially committing overt crimes himself, what kind of example? What do you expect that to do inside the FBI? As an example, I know from talking to FBI agents from all over the country, they were and still are amazed at the things that top people in the FBI in Washington did to destroy FBI credibility. And of course, I think part of that was a result of Robert Mueller's 5-year up or out policy. He used it to eliminate people in the FBI that had more law enforcement experience than him. He ran off thousands and thousands of years of experienced, ethical, moral, upstanding FBI agents. You might wonder, why would an FBI director run off their most experienced agents from all over the country? And really, the only reason I can think of that you would do that, young guys coming right out of school that are patriotic, they come in, they take their orders. They don't have the experience to know when it's a stupid order or maybe a improper order. And so they're not going to talk back. They're going to salute Mueller and go do what he said. Whereas he knew that people that are longer in the tooth, that have been around when he ordered one of his ridiculous policies into effect that he'd later have to repeal, he didn't want the experienced FBI agent saying, "Sir, I know it seems like a good idea, but 15 years ago we tried that and here was the result. It doesn't work out like you think it's going to." Mueller didn't want anybody there that would do that kind of thing. He didn't want anybody that knew more than he did. He ran off thousands of years of experience. I cannot help personally but think if Mueller had not run off so many thousands of years of FBI experience, there would have been people around inside the FBI who could have nudged an FBI director like Comey to avoid committing crimes, could have encouraged an idiot like Peter Strzok, maybe a great law enforcement officer at one time, but clearly immoral, illegal in his conduct, and a disgrace to the FBI. And a guy that can lie with a smirk on his face. That was pretty impressive. But there would have been people around to say, you can't do that. And if you don't stop, I'm going to report you. Well, Mueller ran those guys off. He didn't want people like that. A good example is the FBI agent that after Ted Stevens, under the Mueller FBI, was tried and convicted of a crime that he did not commit right before the election, so he lost his seat in the U.S. Senate. We had an FBI agent came forward, filed an affidavit that he swore to. The FBI had, in effect, manufactured a case against Ted Stevens that did not exist, that he did not accept hundreds of thousands of improvement to his home. He paid for them. He overpaid for them, but the FBI did their raids. They hid evidence that he needed to, and it would have exonerated, not just raised a reasonable doubt, but completely exonerated himself. And the FBI agent identified his superior that participated in manufacturing that crime. So what happened with Mueller as director of the FBI when he finds out, if he didn't already know, that he had a supervisor agent who manufactured a case to convict an innocent man? Well, the Mueller FBI ran off the guy that filed the affidavit because he had a conscience, and Mueller didn't want people of conscience in the FBI under him. He wanted people that would salute Mueller, salute the flag, and do whatever he wanted done. And apparently in that case, even manufacturing a criminal case against a U.S. senator, the longest serving Republican in the Senate at that time. And of course, you have the case of Dr. Stephen Hatfield. Mueller had no evidence whatsoever that Stephen Hatfield was guilty of the anthrax crime that killed and harmed people after 9/11. And at one point, the non-existence of any evidence caused, apparently, from reports, President George W. Bush to call Mueller in and say, hey, it doesn't look like there's any evidence here. Are you really sure that Dr. Hatfield is the anthrax defendant, the guy? And Mueller reportedly said, I am 100% certain. There was no evidence. None. He just had a feeling. He basically framed an innocent man, and ultimately the U.S. government had to pay over $6 million in settlement to Dr. Hatfield. He didn't really get his life back. We still talk about him in terms of anthrax. But when Mueller was asked if he had any regrets, apologies, he said absolutely not. He had no apologies. He didn't care if he ruined an innocent man's life. Never apologized about Ted Stevens. And of course, Ted Stevens was killed in a plane he would never have been on if the Mueller FBI had not manufactured a case against him. So it shouldn't come as a big surprise here that you have a Mueller team. It's got to be Mueller investigators. They're the ones that were doing this investigation. And they're leaking their own documents that are not to be leaked. Well, unless they're directed to by Mueller, so I guess that's a possibility. But anyway, leaking this to the press, and it wasn't just one FBI agent, according to the BuzzFeed News editor-in-chief, because he says in the story he wrote that they had, and I'm quoting, senior law enforcement sources, and they gave BuzzFeed, this liberal news organization, being kind here, gave them the FBI notes to try to bring pressure on Cohen. That's the reason normally that law enforcement does this, to build up public hysteria against somebody and hatred for someone so that they ultimately give up and agree to testify however they're asked to testify. Now, this BuzzFeed editor also says, at the time, the sources asked reporters to keep the information confidential. But with the publication of Mueller's report, they have permitted its release. That is so outrageous. I mean, was nothing learned from the FBI framing the wrong person in the Atlanta bombing case? Apparently not. What happened to Kirk Weldon? He used to come speak from this very podium multiple times in 2000. It was in my first term. I think it was mainly in 2006. And he kept alleging that the FBI had information that they knew there was going to be a terrorist attack, just like what happened on 9/11. And I didn't know where Congressman Weldon knew what he was talking about. He sure seemed to. And he kept making these allegations that the FBI didn't do their job. They could have saved 3,000 American lives on 9/11. Anyway, it was very tough allegations at the FBI. And as a freshman, I'm thinking, wow, Mueller's got to come back and respond to this. This looks bad for the FBI. Even though he only took over shortly before 9/11, it still makes his FBI look bad. Mueller's got to come out and address this. And apparently, Director Mueller, FBI Director Mueller, did address the allegations of Congressman Kirk Weldon, because 2 weeks before his election that year in 2006, there was a raid of Weldon office, his daughter's law office, and it was early morning, and the press was all there. Gee, had to have been the FBI. They're doing the raid. They got the press all there, and in no time at all, there were protesters with already made signs at Kirk Weldon's office calling him all kinds of thief and different things. And that occurring 2 weeks before the election caused him to narrowly lose. And then some months later, they were notified by the FBI, oh, by the way, you can come get all that stuff we seized during our raid. We didn't really use it for a grand jury or anything. They apparently used it to defeat Kirk Weldon as a member of Congress who made them feel bad. An intelligent person might ask, well, look, if that's what the FBI has done to people in the past, whether Hatfield or Weldon or Stevens, aren't you concerned doing just what Kirk Weldon did? And the fact is, it should be a matter of concern. We are seeing, even from BuzzFeed, how the FBI will disclose information that's not even accurate to bring down public opinion against both a witness and, in that case, the president himself, just to smear somebody's name even when it's not accurate. So it should be a matter of concern. But if people don't stand up in this body, actually the way Jerry Nadler used to years ago, about concerns with federal law enforcement activities. If we don't stand up here, nobody's going to, and it isn't going to get better. So it's a risk we got to take because somebody's got to speak up about these outrageous abuses. And they truly are abuses. Now, as the evidence continues to come out, what appears to be quite clear was not that there was collusion or conspiracy between the Trump campaign to bring down Hillary Clinton as a candidate, but the Russian effort has not changed. Not when they were the Soviet Union, and now that it's an independent country of Russia. They want to cause as much problem and division in the United States as they can. And boy, did it work this time. Just a little over a week ago, apparently, former MI6 agent, secret agent, he's no 007, that's for sure, but Christopher Steele, hired by Fusion GPS, also hired Nellie Orr, who is the wife of a top FBI official named Bruce Orr, and she was digging up dirt, whatever she could find. That was why she was hired on Donald Trump. And Christopher Steele, who hated candidate Donald Trump, was hired to dig up dirt on Donald Trump. And as I understand it, he didn't even go to Russia. He's calling, emailing, whatever he needs to do to communicate. And word gets out around Russia, this British agent, now working for the Clinton campaign through Fusion GPS and working with at least one FBI top official. He's looking for dirt on Donald Trump in Russia. Steele is now basically admitted, you know what? It could well be that the people that gave me this dirt about prostitutes and Donald Trump, it's now turned out to be 100% fabricated. It's possible that those could be agents for Vladimir Putin. You think? You bet. Russia was able to divide this country and had plenty of willing accomplices in what turned out to be an outrageously corrupt top in the FBI and some in the DOJ. Now, I know Mr. Rosenstein has said, he was joking when he said he would wear a wire into the Oval Office to try to trap Donald Trump as president so they could try to remove him as president. I mean, they were working on a coup. But from what I understand, we know he was not joking because there was a second meeting in which Andy McCabe and another person, at least one more person, were there when Rosenstein brought it up on his own again. Hey, I wasn't kidding. I really am a team player. I know you're mad at me for the memo about Comey that allowed him to be fired, but I'm a team player. I want to be part of the team. I'll wear a wire into the Oval Office to try to trap the president. I'm really willing to do that. And McCabe, apparently, just blown away that Rosenstein would offer to do that again, goes back and has a meeting with his subordinates and says, you won't believe Rosenstein just brought up again. He's willing to wear a wire into the Oval Office. I don't know what's wrong with that guy. Well, there is a massive stench that has existed, came about during the Obama administration, came about when Robert Mueller ran off so many of our incredibly qualified, upstanding FBI agents. And I was hoping that when Christopher Wray came in, he would help clean up the mess, get rid of the bad actors, but he's been more of hold what you got and try to make the picture look rosier. And why would I say that? Because I know from having talked to the individuals that found the information, they knew that Hillary Clinton's private server was hacked by a foreign country, and it was not Russia. And I knew at the time I was asking Peter Strzok questions, but I didn't mention the country. But now it's come out that a Chinese intelligence agency had embedded instructions in her private server that every email coming in and every email going out was to go to this Chinese intelligence agency. And it happened. And we also now know there was classified information that came and went through her private server. But the Inspector General for our intelligence community was so concerned, he told his investigator, Frank Rucker, Frank, you got to get over there and tell the FBI. They don't know that her private server was hacked. You got to go tell them. And this didn't come out in the hearing. I didn't bring it up, but I did ask Strzok, because we know from his private texting that he was doing everything he could to exonerate Hillary Clinton and doing everything he could to prevent Donald Trump from becoming president. And so it had to come as an incredible blow to Peter Strzok when the intelligence community's investigator, their IG investigator, comes over to the FBI as directed by the IG, and he has to tell Peter Strzok because he's director of counterintelligence at the FBI. And they have their liaison there, Dean Chappelle, and they have another person there. And the IG also sent over one of their top lawyers, Jeanette Mitchell. And Rucker says, I needed to get you this information, and you weren't responding. So here it is. We now have proof positive that Hillary Clinton's private server was hacked, and it was hacked by China. And it's going, every email coming in, going out, it's going to their intelligence agency. And this didn't come out in the hearing, but the fact is, he was shocked at the response by Peter Strzok because he just looked at him. He showed no surprise. And Chappelle and Strzok thanked Frank Rucker for the information, shook his hand, and sent him on his way as if it were no big deal. So where does Christopher Wray come in there? After that came out, that our United States intelligence IG had proof positive that Hillary Clinton's private server had been hacked. And after it was exposed, what a detriment, possibly criminal activity by Peter Strzok. And after it came out that they were instructed that her private server was hacked, what does Christopher Wray's FBI do? They release an official statement that the FBI still has not seen any evidence that Hillary Clinton's private server was hacked. That was despicably dishonest. All they had to do was contact the intelligence community, IG's office. They could have gotten the information, but Christopher Wray was more interested in trying to preserve the old reputation of the FBI that he continued with the facade. Well, yeah, we put on our blinders. We see no evil. We hear no evil. We don't know about any evil. We're not going to go look at the evidence that absolutely unequivocally shows her private server was hacked. We will just ignorantly and intentionally mislead the American people and say, we haven't seen any evidence that her private server was hacked. This is a dangerous, dangerous time in our history. And people can throw all the rocks at Bob Barr. I didn't know the guy. I don't think I've ever met the man. And I had concerns because he was a private friend of Bob Mueller and his wife was a friend of Mrs. Mueller. I had concerns. And now that he is trying to get to the bottom of all the corruption within the FBI and top of the DOJ, the rocks are being hurled. But this should be a time when we come together to try to root out the corruption. Because if they can attempt a coup of a duly elected president, whether you like the Electoral College or not, they can do it to a Republican. Then the day can come when you have conservative people who disagree with a liberal president and decide to take him out the way they made so much inroads in almost taking out Donald Trump. This is a scary time in our history, and I literally hope and pray, and I know there are people that make fun of the prayers, but I truly believe prayers have brought about God's blessing on this country, and we've got a chance to fix things here. But it's going to take courage by people that are willing to stand up to an FBI, some corruption at the top. There's still some people at the FBI who do not like Donald Trump, and they're still there, and they still would like to cover for people that were helping try to effectuate this attempted coup on Donald Trump. They need to go, but we need people. I mean, it used to be, and I know personally, assistant U.S. attorneys that are career, FBI agents that were career. Most of the time, you didn't even know how they voted. You don't know if they did vote because they had one interest, getting to the truth of whether or not there was probable cause a crime was committed, and if so, who probably committed it. That gets them an indictment. Then they can go for a conviction. That's what they were interested in, enforcing the law. But the FBI under Robert Mueller became, and then James Comey became an instrument to abuse enemies, and it's got to be cleaned up. And I've seen no indication Christopher Wray is interested in doing that. He's covering for the guys that created the problem. Maybe he's doing some things internally I'm not seeing, but he's not the answer. For the sake of continuing this little experiment in self-government, we need to clean up the mess at the FBI in Washington, D.C., and the mess that still has existence in the top of the Justice Department. And then we can have a chance to keep this little experiment self-government going. I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition? Without objection.
Mrs. Speaker, I rise to praise this body for passing H.R. 9, the Climate Action Now Act, of which I am a proud co-sponsor. Climate change is the greatest existential threat to our species. It is also an unequivocal economic opportunity. Replacing the need to extract and burn fossil fuels with renewable and clean energy saves money. This White House is failing to seize on this domestic opportunity while simultaneously walking away from our international partners and competitors who are committed to this challenge. Of all the misguided decisions of this administration, few have been as reckless as announcing our withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement. It's environmentally foolish. It is economically naive, and it cedes leadership to China and others on the defining challenge of our time. That's foolhardy. H.R. 9 is a reclamation of that mantle. It is a demonstration that Americans are determined to lead, even if the White House is refusing to do so. I'm proud to be a part of this effort, not because it's enough, but because it's the kind of leadership into the breach that has long defined true American greatness. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
You can't go home until I let you go.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Seek to make a motion to adjourn.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 2:30 p.m. tomorrow.
Well, the House has passed a bill to keep the United States in